The crisis, decline, and fall of the Roman Empire. The city which hath taken the whole world was itself taken. Writing around 411 CE, Jerome, one of the great early church fathers, a writer who framed elements of Christianity for centuries to come, described an immense event he had just recently heard about. Jerome lived in Bethlehem in the Roman province of Palaestina Prima, where he had moved decades earlier to live in the land where Jesus Christ had once ministered. Even here, though, news had quickly reached him of this event. Far to the west, on the 24th of August in the year 410 CE, an army of Germanic warriors led by Alaric the Goth, mostly of a group called the Visigoths, had sacked the city of Rome. It was the first time in exactly 800 years that a foreign power had managed to enter and sack the Eternal City. Reflecting on the news, Jerome wrote, "The city which hath taken the whole world was itself taken." It was a momentous event, one which begs a number of questions. First and foremost, how had the capital of an empire which covered most of the known world and which had conquered nearly all its enemies over many centuries been sacked? In answering this, the wider question of how Rome's crisis, decline and fall came about arises. The 3rd century crisis. Any assessment of the crisis, decline and fall of the Roman Empire must begin with what historians term the 3rd century crisis. This was a period in Rome's history running from 235 CE to 284 CE. During this half a century, the Roman Empire entered into a period of profound instability, one which pointed towards glaring weaknesses in the empire's structure. As recently as the first half of the 2nd century CE, the Romans had seemed invincible, continuing to conquer people such as the Britons, Dacians, and Nabateans when they cared to, while Emperor Trajan had even marched into Mesopotamia and temporarily conquered the Parthian Empire, Rome's bitterest enemy, in a swift campaign between 114 CE and 117 CE. Thereafter, though, crises began to develop. Firstly, there was a growing problem with the Roman military. The legions had become far too strong over the centuries, and there were already instances where they had selected who would be the emperor of Rome, most notably during the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE. A similar year of the 5 emperors occurred in 193 CE, following the assassination of the Emperor Commodus. This eventually resulted in the creation of the relatively stable Severan dynasty. But when it ended in 235 CE, the empire was plunged into a succession of civil wars, which would last almost without interruption for half a century between 235 CE and 284 CE. During this period, there were literally dozens of emperors proclaimed by the legions. Some only ruled for a period of months before in turn being deposed and replaced. Others only held control of small amounts of territory. Historians remain divided on exactly how many of these pretenders to the imperial title even count as emperors. The never-ending civil wars in turn created a fiscal crisis as successive rulers began reducing the silver content of the Roman coinage in an effort to pay off the legions to support them. This, in turn, created a spiral of hyperinflation, with the Roman coins being reduced to as little as 5% silver. Finally, this era saw the beginning of the Volkerwanderung, the wandering of the people, a period in which Germanic and Asiatic tribes from Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and east along the Pontic-Caspian steppe to the Asian steppe began migrating westwards into Central Europe to the borders of the Roman Empire. By the 2030s, CE tribes such as the Franks, Sarmatians, and Alemanni were breaching Rome's northern border and invading Gaul and other provinces. It was the beginning of 2.5 centuries of unceasing attacks on Rome's borders along the River Rhine and River Danube. All of this brought the empire to its knees in the middle of the 3rd century CE. It would soon recover from this initial crisis, though only to some extent. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. The 3rd century crisis did not bring about Rome's fall. Instead, the situation was stabilized from 284 CE onwards, after a military commander by the name of Diocletian came to power as emperor. Diocletian would reign for over 2 decades and would initiate a series of reforms which stabilized the empire. He introduced some reform of the coinage, implemented measures designed to reduce the anarchy which the legions had introduced into Rome's politics, and, most importantly, created a system of co-rulership within the empire which would have major consequences for the remainder of the empire's history. This involved the administrative division of the empire into western and eastern halves. There would then be 4 rulers going forward, a senior emperor in the west and one in the east, and a junior emperor underneath each of these. When a senior emperor died, he would be automatically succeeded by the junior one, who would in turn appoint a new junior emperor to succeed him one day. Diocletian's system, known as the Tetrarchy, was pivotal in beginning the process whereby the empire was split in 2. His reforms were matched in importance by those introduced by his near successor, Constantine the Great. After winning a new civil war in 312 CE, he began the process of establishing Christianity, a religion which had ballooned in popularity across the empire during the 3rd century crisis, as the official religion of the Roman Empire. This was a seismic event, one which would transform European society over time. Rome would soon be gone, but its legacy to the medieval world would be Christianity, a monotheistic religion, where one god was worshipped rather than a polytheistic one, where multiple gods were worshipped of the kind which had dominated the ancient world. The Goths and the division of the empire. While Diocletian and Constantine had done much to stabilize the empire after the crisis of the 3rd century, notably in terms of ending the perpetual civil wars and reforming the coinage, they could not stop the tide of migration of Germanic and Asiatic tribes across Eurasia to Rome's borders. By the time Constantine died in 337 CE, new groups were emerging north of the Black Sea. The foremost were the Goths, a Germanic people who had possibly migrated south from Scandinavia. They would soon split into 2 confederacies known broadly today in the historiography as the Visigoths, or Western Goths, and Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths. Further to the west, the Franks and groups such as the Alemanni, Burgundians, Saxons, Angles, and Vandals continued to press on the Rhine border, often infiltrating the border for many years and pillaging the rich towns and cities of the empire. It was in this environment that the system of multiple rulers that Diocletian had set up decades earlier would lead to a full-blown division of the Roman Empire. Over time, the senior emperors in Rome and the eastern capital that Constantine had built during his reign, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, began playing the Germanic tribes off against one another. For instance, it was Theodosius I who ruled the eastern provinces between 379 CE and 395 CE, who first convinced the Goths that they should stop attacking his provinces in the Balkans and instead head west to strike at Italy. The result, after years of attacks, was the sack of Rome by the Goths in 410 CE. The Scourge of God. 410 CE was an important watershed moment in Rome's history in more ways than one. That very same year, the Roman legions in Britain strategically withdrew from the island to Gaul, a clear sign of how drastic the strategic situation had become. This was in part a reaction to the Vandals invading Gaul a few years earlier. They then rampaged southwards towards the Pyrenees and crossed over into Hispania in 409 CE. They would eventually move through the region before crossing over the Straits of Gibraltar to establish their own kingdom in North Africa in the 4020s AD. This left the Western Roman Empire largely reduced to Italy, the Alps, Gaul, and Hispania. And this would not last much longer either. In the 4030s AD, it met a new nemesis, one which Roman Christians came to know as the Scourge of God. This was Attila the Hun, leader of the Huns, a great confederacy of Asiatic people who had conquered a vast swathe of territory between Hungary in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. In the 4030s and 4040s, CE Attila invaded the Roman Empire on many occasions and obtained huge tribute from Rome to stop him from invading Italy itself and sacking the city again. His premature death in 453 AD was all that saved the Western Roman Empire from ultimate destruction at the hands of the Huns. The end of the Western Roman Empire. Attila's death in 453 CE might have seemed like a great reprieve for the Western Roman Empire, but it was entirely illusory. Just 2 years later, the Vandals, who had conquered much of North Africa and established their own kingdom there several decades earlier, launched a naval expedition back across the Mediterranean and had sacked Rome in 455 CE. The second time in less than half a century that the Eternal City had fallen prey to a foreign foe. The manner in which they ransacked the city saw them leave their name, the Vandals, behind as a byword for mindless violence. Vandalism, it was the beginning of the end. By then, Germanic warlords were establishing themselves as the rulers of a number of Germanic kingdoms throughout the former provinces of the Western Roman Empire. The Franks and Burgundians took over Gaul. The Suebi and Visigoths acquired control over Hispania, while the Ostrogoths, after much wandering around Europe over the previous 2 centuries, finally moved into the Italian peninsula and took control of it. In 476 CE, the inevitable happened. One of the leaders of this Ostrogothic horde, a warlord by the name of Odoacer, deposed the last ruler of the Western Roman Empire, Emperor Romulus Augustulus. With this, the empire in the West came to an end just over half a millennium after Caesar Augustus had become the first Roman emperor in 27 BCE. It was a defining historical moment, one which is seen as marking the final transition from the world of antiquity into the medieval era. The Byzantine Empire. Of course, the Roman Empire did not completely cease to exist in 476 CE. To the east, the Eastern Roman Empire was still proving quite resilient in the face of attacks against its borders in the Balkans and the Middle East. In fact, in the early 6th century CE, during the long reign of Emperor Justinian, it would launch expeditions westwards and reconquer substantial parts of the Western Roman Empire in Italy, North Africa, and along the Mediterranean coastline of Hispania. Ultimately, the Eastern Roman Empire would last for nearly 1,000 years after the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It was only in 1453 that Constantinople was finally conquered by the Ottoman Empire of the Turks, and the Roman Empire in the East ceased to exist. However, this was clearly a different polity to the Roman Empire that had birthed it. This was a power ruled by Greek Christians and adhering to very different cultural and social mores than had the Latin Romans of antiquity. a development made clear in that historians refer to this as the Byzantine Empire after the 5th century CE rather than the Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire died in the 5th century CE. It had come about after a long process of crisis, decline, and fall. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.